It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Tim Meek, who's one of those rare beings who combines practical expertise with academic excellence. This is where you blush. Tim is an award-winning bricklayer who turned archaeologist and is now also a specialist in traditional lime technology, especially with regard to the external coating of buildings in Scotland. He was billed to talk to us about lime in conservation, but instead he's going to ask the question, are the precepts conserve as found and honest repair climate resilient? A Scottish perspective.
I want to begin by presenting you with an argument. We've moved from masonry understood to be covered, where architecture is seamless and therefore seamly, to architecture where exposing the joint in parallel with bare stone has become everything. When I think of pointing, I think of it as the final iteration of a cultural process, one that's exposed us to the loss of fabric rather than its care. So we've settled into a sort of curated neglect rather than a reflection of the aspirations of those who commissioned work and the intangible heritage of those who undertook it. Disappointingly, I've all the imagination of the field bowl. I'm only interested in the facts and how the data stacks up. And this is at the core of my talk to you today. I stand before you as an academic tradesman, which for all our lack of safety, undisciplined approach, our filth, our mess, our drunkenness, and cheers, by the way, we still managed to produce the mason architects of the past. Men like Palladio, John Milne, William Adam, and the much underrated James Smith, men who understood the relationship between form and function in all its detail. The problem is twofold. Conservation has come to mean pointing, and the process has accrued values that are unsustainable now and in a climate-changed future. And within the canon of pointing, the process is one-dimensional, a single universal style throughout the country. Therefore, the aim of this talk is to examine the cultural and physical factors in the history and development of traditional external lime coats. On the left is what Gerard Lynch calls the heritage joint, where the mortar is recessed and beaten with a churn brush to expose the aggregates. On the right, an example of traditional Scots flushed, lined-out pointing. The question I raise today is, how did we arrive at a point where evidence is inconsequential? Polymath Mary Somerville was a chemist, astronomer, and core figure in the Scottish Enlightenment. She's been described as certainly the most extraordinary woman in Europe, a mathematician of the very, very first rank. Her book, The Mechanism of the Heavens, was the set text for undergraduates at Cambridge, and her work on the connection of the physical sciences was only surpassed by Darwin's Origin of Species, and her efforts translating algebra into common language remains a hallmark of mathematical dissection. Florence Nightingale is best remembered for her pioneering nursing work in the Crimean War. She was able to achieve this with her understanding of training, sanitary care, and crucially, statistics. With the use of data visualization and the polar area diagram, she was able to demonstrate that severe trauma did not inevitably lead to death, and the concept of professional nursing was the lasting outcome. Both women used empirical observations to develop methodologies that in turn tested a hypothesis. They processed data, and the results confirmed or rejected the hypothesis. Only then could a conclusion be established. Once the results were scrutinized by a wider community, change was initiated. The language of Ruskin and the SBAB plays a part in restraining the heritage industry from analysis, because it's an attractive outsourcing of the critical acumen of a comfortable and frankly lazy audience. In The Stones of Venice, Ruskin uses the term exquisite 24 times, while in The Lamps, precious is similarly overworked. The language of heritage is directed at a particular social and economic group are articulate and know how to generate support. So, for example, this darling little jewel of a building must be saved for the nation, will turn the hearts of many. And they can do so without defining who that nation is. It certainly isn't my family. The lime world does a similar thing. Currently, there's much debate about the benefits of high calcium versus hydraulic limes. But rather than sticking to the facts, high calcium has become pure, meaning the other is impure, and hydraulic has accrued a natural pronoun, meaning any alternative is somehow less wholesome. Both sides attempting to squeeze a little more morality away from the opposition. This well-ordered contemporary building site presents the bricklayers and their work in a highly professional way. The unspoken truth of knowing how to get things done efficiently and well has intangible heritage writ large. They are bricklayers. They're not heritage bricklayers, lime plasterers, or building conservators. Adding such pronouns and post-nominals adds 30% to the cost and switches hard hats and boots for berets and cravats. If you can't build a house from footings to DPC and from there to eaves and gable and do it with alacrity, how can you be expected to understand the role of brickwork at Hampton Court? The transition in practice these lads and lasses would need to work in lime is tiny. The transition for many working in the heritage industry to the coherence of this site would be insurmountable. The language of heritage portrays conservation as an art, but in reality, it's professional building work, or at least it should be. My friend Peter Berman makes an interesting point. Ruskin is more read about than read, and the heritage industry just soaks up the highlights and spits them back out, waiting for the applause. In The Seven Lamps, Ruskin is forthright. The true colours of architecture are those of natural stone. This doesn't actually stand up to scrutiny. Surely the true colours of architecture are whatever cultural, political, religious and environmental constraints there are at any given time. But to cover brick with cement and divide this cement with joints that it may look like stone is to tell a falsehood ignores the presentational and functional evidence that simply overwhelms us. All the fair devices that were ever fancied are not worth a lie. Leave your walls as plain board or build them of baked mud and chopped straw if need be. But do not roughcast them with a falsehood. This displays the most profound lack of understanding for the vernacular building process with no substantiating evidence. Ruskin's disavowal of science was inherited by Morris and Webb, and that reluctance to consider evidence systematically and impartially remains at the heart of the heritage industry. After the First World War, there was a recognition that the idea of a romantic ruin was no longer sustainable, and that many ivy-clad medieval buildings were in catastrophic decline, and that intervention was crucial. Sir Charles Peers and architect Frank Bain effectively invented the Ancient Monuments Department. And their approach was very much conserve as found and a display of the archaeological remains. And the methodology for the conservation of ruins morphed into the language of roof buildings. But archaeology surely isn't a finish. It's a process, and minimum intervention doesn't stop decay. The science on that is really clear. Water, temperature, salt, biological growth, pollution, etc. are the causes. So I ask myself, are we practicing the legibility of curated neglect under the twin banners of honesty and archaeology? In this talk, I'll demonstrate that there's a dissonance between the evidence and conservation strategies. The Ruskin view that stone is inviolate has inhibited the heritage industry from academic or practical inquiry, a position supported by the principles of conserve as found and honest repair, which have been adopted by the international charters. In recent years, these principles have been robustly challenged. Wells 2010, Glendinning 2013, Emmerich 2014, the Borough Charter, NARA document. But crucially, they're largely ignored by the heritage industry. The principles of conservation, I argue, have become the problem, and have stifled inquiry. Let me give you a little sense of what I mean. Multispectral imaging identifies different colours by their variable wavelengths, and the process has been used to recognise polychromatic finishes on Greek marbles, in this case the Parthenon. But we find it on Republican and Imperial Roman statuary and external and internal fresco. We find it on medieval work and carving in the early modern period. We've known about polychromatic finishes since the 18th century and neatly boxed the evidence away. In their papers examining authenticity, replicas, and how meanings can evolve, Jones and Foster examine authenticity relative to the Cadboll stone and the St. John's Cross in Iona. What they argue is that exact replicas can take on new significances, which is actually fair enough. My issue is that they predicate their research and conclusions on a bare stone model. It's as if somehow early medieval work slipped off the radar and forgot how to be hyper-real, which is remarkable given other aspects of early medieval cultural life and the precedent of polychromatic work recognised on runic stones in Scandinavia. I accept that this may seem a stretch from Harlem pointing, but what I'm suggesting is that the idea of bare stone has taken a disproportionate hold on contemporary heritage management and is firmly embedded within society at large. The late Charles McKean made an interesting point about the way Scotland is represented as backward, dirty, barely literate. But it'd be wrong to say that this isn't something we don't capitalise on, because the Scottish film industry contributed £568 million to the Scottish economy in 2019. There's no incentive to change that bare stone narrative because there's a price attached to it. In the 2018 film Mary Queen of Scots, Hollywood Palace is presented as a cave, while the English court civilised and dainty. So how the past is presented matters, and finishes play a role in this. I ask myself, has the naturalistic truth of Ruskin been spun for political ends as the debate around Scotland's independence becomes pressing? From the outset, our research demonstrated that we knew very little about the spatial and temporal extent of lime coats in Scotland, so we adopted a no previous knowledge baseline. The fieldwork identified an unbroken thread of completely covering buildings, primarily with Harl from the 12th to the late 17th century, when we see the introduction of bare stone, what many of you would call ashlar. Significantly, the process of adopting a bare stone paradigm in the north and west of Scotland is much slower to evolve. That evolution takes place in several forms and made clear with a study of over 300 examples. The results have been published online as Historic Environment Scotland's technical papers 31 and 33, and the fieldwork continues with PhD candidate Kate North's research. I want to take you through the methodology. It began as desk-based analysis in a number of occasions. So in this example, Edinburgh Castle, we used evidence from prints, which questions the current presentation. Similarly, early 18th century paintings suggest a different narrative for the Edinburgh Old Town, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. A position substantiated by archive photographs. The collective desktop study was then compared with the on-site evidence, which within the context of the heavily cleaned Canongate, we found only fragments. Nonetheless, you can begin to build up a compelling story by integrating different evidence sources. A late 18th century watercolour and archive images from 1913 of St Clement's Church, Rhodlawn Harris, show the church with almost complete lime cover. But it also provides us with a rare documentary source, with architect Alexander Ross proclaiming the writer of these notes had the pleasure of removing the plaster from the walls and repointing them. That was my 19th century voice, by the way. In contrast, Stuart William writing to John Adam in 1790, when Adam was heading up the Board of Ordnance, complains that recent internal painting work has been spoiled because the house was not rough cast. Interestingly, not much has changed in 250 years, it still leaks and there's still no harling on it. The physical evidence was divided into two groups, primary and secondary. In more detail, we looked at mortar colour. We looked at binder aggregate dissolution, meaning that the binder dissolves away from the aggregate, and the mortar friability, how well it crushed between our fingers. We looked at lime inclusions, those are the little white dots you can see in the mortar. We assessed mortars made by burning marine resources, shells for example, and included as aggregates. We also confirmed lime finishes by the presence of Leesgang mortar swirls. I want to turn to site selection and the impact of unforeseen observations. So let's return to St Clement's. A planned inspection, following a desk-based analysis with compelling results. So far, so good. More compelling, however, are previously unrecorded buildings en route. So the bulk of the entries for the study aren't the planned observations at all, but the unforeseen. Let's not underestimate the value of drive-by archaeology. In this case, perched on a hillside, isolated and seen at a distance. By stopping and snooping, one can soon develop a more meaningful metric. The inclusion of unforeseen observations changed the study from formal, planned, localized investigation to large-scale, nationwide randomized survey. I'm trying to highlight that there is no bias in the survey. We didn't focus on specific areas with prior knowledge, so I can't stress how important unforeseen observations are, but it was significant how few of the planned observations described finish in the listing, scheduling, or CANMore descriptions. The frightening thing is that the survey was easy. The question for me is, why has nobody looked? We looked at the full range of building types in Scotland. These are just a few. I want to take a few moments and look at places of evidence and how and where to look for them. In this example, a not particularly interesting 19th century church hardly seems worth the effort of stopping. Yet looking that bit closer gives us a sense of what might have been an earlier interpretation, traces of harl on each elevation. Closer still, and tucked behind a headstone, we get a better sense of complete cover, full harl and lime wash. As we will see, the survival of lime wash is a crucial outcome of the study. By the way, it turns out that our pal Alexander Ross from St Clement's was behind the stripping of this church. Similarly, basements and roof spaces where later additions conceal earlier iterations of the building. In this case, New Hales House by James Smith in 1686, with later additions by William Adam in 1720, the latter conserving the evidence of lined out plaster, which Adam then replicates. Below-ground archaeology also has a place. In this example, an early 13th century wall was made more substantial later in the century, and that development conserved the earlier external plaster. A consistent observation throughout the study was how little attention we archaeologists have given external lime coats, even when they are patently obvious. So we've moved from drive-by archaeology to archaeology of the telly. If we're to build resilience, we need to consider that relationship between presentation and functionality. Here we're presented with a formal sandstone front, contrasted with a basalt rubble gable end. The harl was removed from the gable and repointed with the heritage joint. In doing so, ledges and troughs have been created all over the gable. Now water can only be tabled back into the wall core through porous joints. So we've moved from conserve as found to do what you like because we've ticked that materials are all that matters box. The evidence in practice today demonstrates that we are not prepared for a climate change future, and using lime doesn't equate to conservation. We can identify former complete lime finishes not simply because there are traces, but because pointed rubble of this type is illogical. And let's just sling into the evidence mix bonding characteristics. Here you can see the lack of regularity in the coursing and bonding. In some cases, near straight joints. We have to ask ourselves, is this the polite architecture of the late Georgian period? And if we move into the concealed area under the stair, we find finish still clinging to the basalt and rybat tail. We can also see limewash hanging onto the raised margin, even though someone's had a really good go at angle grinding it off. And if we get right under the arch, we get a sense of limewash covering the mortar and margin, rendering the building seamless and therefore seamly. We considered the hierarchy of elevations. So on the front, we can see regularized basalt blocks, sandstone raised margins, and rusticated coins. On the sides and rear is random rubble. All elevations have substantial traces of lime finishes. So why the difference in style? Why square the most miserable building material in Scotland? The most likely reason is that the front was plastered and lined out relative to the coins, while the sides and rear were harled. All elevations then linked by lime wash. What we looked at was the combination of resources, and this included the presentation of self through the medium of home. Are we saying that this very self-satisfied couple, living in a world where an audience is never absent and whose lives are tightly circumscribed by taste and politeness, will be happy looking like rural clods through the medium of architecture? For me, the epistemological constraint flies out of the window when we consider the accumulated evidence of archaeology, functionality, and presentation. In short, a triangulated approach. Staying with secondary evidence, if we look at the arch between the nave and the choir, we can see a polychromatic scheme applied to a fine line plaster, the plaster acting as a gesso, all made possible by droving on the stone surface. We can see that the Victorian cleaners haven't managed to pick away the remains of the gesso on each side of the nose. Recent Roman finds in Carlisle are just outstanding. The interpretation of the crude tooling has been attributed to the sculpture being located out of plain sight. We can rethink this hypothesis if we consider instead two different skill sets. The first, where local resources allow for detailed fine masonry carving with colour applied directly to Roman marble, for example. And a second, where the available stone was not of high quality. In the second scenario, the virtuosity of the plaster came to the fore, and on the right is a 3rd century BC Etruscan example. Now we can begin to consider a very different attitude towards stone and a more nuanced skill set. Learning how and where to look is an evolving area of research, as Kate North's fieldwork is demonstrating. At Fountains Abbey, Kate is comparing the external and internal masonry styles. And we can see that the two styles are the same. Given the increased exposure on the exterior, the mason seems to be bare stone, while the interior retains plaster. But with closer scrutiny, that's a position which is increasingly difficult to substantiate. Once we understand the principles of traditional building practice and how and where to look for evidence, then we can apply the logic of backward induction. Can we then begin to reimagine not just plastered surfaces, but a polychromatic Scotland when Catholicism dominated the religious and secular world, now applied to the exterior of buildings? Let's turn to the results of the survey. The evidence for much larger aggregates than we are currently using was compelling, but early examples of limewash fragmentary. The other crucial outcome of the survey was the identification of a relationship between wall building and finishing during construction, meaning the masonry was coated while it was being built rather than waiting till the structure was complete. The process has implications for the robustness of finishes by creating the perfect conditions in which carbonation can take place. It also applies to the curing of hydraulic motors. A relative humidity of between 40 and 80% over time. What is significant is the strength of the mortar at the joints and demonstrated by its long-term survival. But it also gives us an insight into the intangible heritage of masonry walling, a building process that was understood to be covered from the point of construction, hence William Adams' term for rubble work as rough work, meaning well built but intended to be obscured, much as roughing out timber work might be described, and my thanks to William Kay for that reference. Here you can see the relationship between bedding stone and finishing, where there is no separation between the two, and by that I mean there is no drying or carbonation front. We identified several key features. Early Harl was thick and applied as a single coat. There is some evidence for thinner lined out plasters also applied as a single coat. Floss Castle and New Hales House, that's the building we saw early, spring to mind. At no point did we identify the process of Harlow plaster applied as a multi-coat system. By the early 18th century, Harls in lowland and central belt areas reduced in thickness, and here you can see the raised margin. The Harl sitting below the front face of the margin, so the shadow is cast by the margin and onto the Harl and not the other way around. This was achieved by an increased refinement in pinning, galleting and snecking throughout the 17th and 18th century. Procedures that add robustness to the structure by helping resist torsion and increase compression, particularly in the perp joints, which don't have the same constant load as the horizontals. It is my view, as a tradesman, that much of the vitriol and virtue signalling about binder type is superseded by the importance of packing the bejesus out of the joint. If we look at the timeline, we can see the wider impact this had on coat thickness. The depth of finish in the early examples is due to wear. The reduction in coat thickness in the 16th and 17th centuries is relative to the refinement in Renaissance architecture when tower house building peaks. Coat thickness levels off during the 18th and 19th centuries and declines thereafter, which corresponds with the reduction in wall width in the same period. So, for clarity, the evidence tells us that as walls diminish in thickness, there is a corresponding diminution in the thickness of coats. But there's a secondary reduction in wall width in the area below the sill in domestic architecture, and it's worth bringing together the reasons why this happens. By the 17th century, neoclassicism was firmly established in tandem with the landscape garden. The Little Ice Age made the garden less accessible in northern Britain. However, the combined technologies of crown glass and the sliding sash window meant that the garden could be experienced from the interior of the building. This is only possible if the space is created within the window area to accommodate the man to a gown. Again, to be clear, the evidence tells us that as lime coats become thinner, there is a reduction in wall width and a further diminution below the window in a residential building of the long 18th century. Finally, we identified that the use of lime wash seems to peak in the 19th century and decline thereafter by a combination of factors, including no longer fashionable and removal. The poor representation of lime wash in the earlier examples is likely to be removal in times of religious strife and wear bias. We simply cannot dismiss wear bias. But can we begin to think about the anthropology of finishes? Because the data anomaly is at odds with the pictorial evidence from much of Europe, where plaster, colour wash, sgraffito are commonplace. It's significant that lime wash was used in strategic areas where the focus was at street level. and more specifically around doors and windows, a position substantiated by archive images. And there is a link to the fieldwork evidence. Limewash remained a process employed in rural areas even into the 20th century. These images confirming the one universal truth in heritage. If you want a job done well, ask women and children and leave men to sweep up, normally ineptly. The on-site archaeology showed the cyclical nature of rewashing, with multiple coats applied to cut details, folding around the chamfered margins and roll mouldings and into the window frames, leaving us with a sense of plaster and limewash used to manage external and internal environments by a process sometimes called hygral buffering, a process directly related to what my pal Robin Pender calls thermal physiology. Anyone who missed Robin's irritatingly brilliant talk last Saturday should seek it out. Her central points being that in the past we were better at managing our internal environments to the betterment of personal physical comfort and well-being. You begin to get a better understanding of the cruciality of triangulated evidence, a methodology we have not previously been good at. However, by the late 18th century, particularly in the central belt and urban areas, the dominant expression of architecture is bare stone. And thereafter, we see the arrival of rubble mania and what we now think of as pointing. We identified 16 different pointing styles, and several factors need to be considered. Firstly, the overwhelming commonality was formality achieved by lining out by pressing into the joint with a purpose-made tool while the mortar was green. Sometimes white lining was added. It might also mean dotting the joints with small shims of slate to create a black definition rather than white. What strikes me about this is the level of skill required and the time it would take at the point of construction. What was lacking within the study was any evidence for the now universal method of a recessed joint beaten with a churn brush. So there's been a constant response to TP 33 running along the lines of, well, I don't like these. I wouldn't have them on my church. You need horsewhipping. And that is absolutely true. I want to be clear here. I'm not asking you to admire the examples. I'm offering you them as evidence. Should our preference be dictating policy? And if so, what is it we're conserving? And crucially, for whom? I think the place we're in now has a 19th century resonance about it, where the morality of using lime has exceeded the function. And I think now is the time to ask ourselves some searching questions. My sense is that the heritage joint is like received pronunciation. It doesn't upset anybody, apart from myself and Gerard Lynch. I want to return to the data I presented earlier, where wall thickness diminishes generally and specifically under windows. The process is repeated floor on floor. Bear in mind that water is discharged from glass at a greater rate than the surrounding masonry. What we can see here is that the window now takes up about 1/3 of the total volume of the elevation. Understanding how all the different elements of a building come together is crucial. So, by putting the elevations, sections, and plan together, we can understand wall morphology as a series of substantial piers, triangulated at the corners, and linked by insubstantial ties. That's the narrow bit underneath the windows. Externally, there are stone lintels with timber supports behind them, onto which the masonry is placed. This houses the floor joists. It's a relationship that's dependent on everything being absolutely dry, which is unlikely because the area is prone to cracking. And this pattern of cracking from top to bottom was near universal in those residential buildings throughout the long 18th century. The consequence of that vulnerability in driving rain is inundation, timber decay, and exponential vulnerability of the structure because the timber is no longer working in tandem with the masonry. William Adam recognised this vulnerability and insisted that floor joist ends were tarred before insertion. And again, my thanks to William Kay for that reference. The isometric helps illustrate how integral timber is in tying the structure together. The timber-safe lintels, the floor joists, and the floorboards act in unison. And this allows you to see all the component parts together, and you can see the cracking from ground level meandering up around the windows, up to the crow step and eaves. Now let's think about the sill. This had to be placed accurately because the window margins are located on it. The margins have incredibly fine joints, so there's very little tolerance for moving them to keep them plumb. The trend noted was to keep the masonry under the sill low and place the sill on padstones, filling the panel below retrospectively. The horizontal sill joint and the panel of rough work is never in compression because it's been slotted in from the front rather than walled from above. In addition, the wall is a single skin with a direct link to the external environment. In this example, you can see the very fine crack just below the sill. It's a crack that's developed in a wall width of no more than 200 millimeters and formed by mortar shrinkage and the stresses and strains of the structure we noted earlier. For clarity, this would not conform to the British standard on solid wall masonry. Masonry of this width, with this degree of exposure, without a coating, would fail to meet the requirements of BS 5628 in new work. So why we think traditional masonry can cope is puzzling. Moreover, not all walls of the same width are equal. We've considered the ideal of a wall as a composite unit, but it's an ideal which is rarely met because movement dislocates the inner and outer leaf from the core into three separate units. The earth lime core in this example has largely washed away. What remains is a parapet of single width masonry, a cornice, and a tripartite wall system with thin masonry skins and an open void core. This is unlikely to remain stable and resilient in its bare stone state, irrespective of line pointing in adverse conditions. Now let's talk about climate. These are Met Office rainfall distribution maps of the UK, and you can see just how wet the west and northwest is. It's also the windiest, with gusting wind speeds during storms Aid and Kiara of up to 70 miles an hour. I want to now look at proof of concept and applied science. Storm conditions with low air pressure are accompanied by wind and rain. The wind that flows around a building is described as dynamic pressure. This is a very general computational fluid dynamic illustration, the blue representing low pressure. You can see that there is a difference in pressure between the front, rear, and sides of the building. But there's also a difference between the external pressure on the windward elevation and the interior, the blue representing low pressure. Let's give a bit more clarity to that general picture. At the external wall face, the velocity of wind and its kinetic energy is curtailed abruptly, creating high pressure. We know all buildings aren't airtight and that there are cracks, often tiny on all elevations. On the windward side, there can be air-water infiltration. If the sum of infiltrating air is less than the sum of exfiltrating air on all the other elevations and the roof combined, then there will be an internal pressure difference. In conditions of wind-driven rain, water enters the building envelope via three agencies: capillarity, driving rain through wide gaps, and pressure difference through tiny cracks. Pressure difference being the corollary of wind. Hypothesis: pressure differences combined with structural deformation can be negated by complete lime coats. We built an airtight chamber and used a dust extractor to replicate the pressure variables expected in storm conditions. The testing regime used was the ASTM standard, which measures air leakage in new buildings at 75 pascals. The baseline for this experiment was 70 pascals pressure difference. The irrigation system delivering water equal to an exceptional but not unheard of event based on Met Office figures. So what we're doing is we're pulling air out of that chamber using the dust extractor to replicate that internal pressure difference. We looked at real pressure differences in storm conditions. These were gusting readings recorded to leaking building during storms Aidan and Kiara. From left to right, 280, 90 and 120 pascals. So we can feel absolutely secure that the testing regime we're using is secure. Pressure difference makes a significant impact when a wall has no surface treatment and where there are very small cracks. In this, pressure differences from 0 to 70 pascals. With no pressure difference, the rate of water entering the chamber was 125 millilitres per minute. At 70 pascals, that increased to 375. At the base of the graph are the various lime treatments, so let's expand them. We can see that all the treatments improve matters. The green trend line indicates the heritage joint. Pointing is the least effective and full rough cast and lime wash the most impactful. When we ratcheted up the pressure difference beyond the 70 pascal baseline, there was an exponential increase in inundation. In this case, we compared the difference between high calcium and hydraulic mortars. The most significant outcome here is the amount of water entering the chamber in the high calcium mortar scenario. This can be accounted for by the amount of shrinkage within the mortar after 3 and 6 months. In contrast, once the high calcium hull had been lime washed, no water entered the chamber, hence there's no trend line. The difference between the effectiveness of the two mortar types is very small. The difference between coated and not coated is colossal. Most would regard New Lanark as a success. It's sanctioned at the highest level, though there is no substantiating evidence. But it does generate income, so income trumps authenticity, with a price tag of stone decay and ultimately loss of the asset. And therein lies the problem. We keep repeating the process, knowing that it's not climate responsible, nor in this case, reflective of the Scottish Enlightenment. I only got this image today. It was from my friend Roger Curtis at Historic Environment Scotland. Moreover, I asked myself, what is the value in trying to retrofit a building where stone decay and water penetration are the inevitable long-term outcomes of a bare stone paradigm? I hear the term building pathology bandied about without any recognition that what they are assessing are buildings without skins. It's up to a new generation to challenge the contemporary source of authority, and this is important because we continue to export the idea that somehow built heritage is a rustic idyll. Okay, let me take you through what I mean by that. Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest was to be his country retreat, and as you can see, it's an octagon. Setting out an octagon requires some thought to make sure that the angles are consistent and that the height of the courses as they return to their starting point remain level and true. In this case, that proved beyond the bricklayer's capabilities, because they've had to lay a brick on edge and there are also multiple straight joints. But hey, it gets worse. Bricklayers call this a coursing pig, meaning they can't get one side of the wall to match up with the other. And it's repeated time and again throughout the construction of Poplar Forest. Let's look at Jefferson. Jefferson was minister to France for 5 years, an attendee at the court of Versailles and Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. He's also a keen amateur architect and follower of Clearaceau, travelling widely through France. Did he sleep through the Place de Vosges? Was he drunk at the Chateau Carouge? Is it possible that the most urbane and learned man in the United States, who's familiar with the trompe l'oeil at Versailles, returns home and accepts the staggeringly lame brickwork as the finished object, rather than understanding it as a base onto which a polite finish could be applied? If the rough work at Poplar Forest is the architectural intent, I will eat hay from a manger with a Virginian donkey. We have managed to export the idea of rusticity, established by proclamation, to the UNESCO ICOMOS process, and there is a price to pay for that. Buildings without resilience and the architecture of the grim dark. The loss of finishes is related to the loss of regional identity and the knowledge that resides in craft. Despite the many critiques of Ruskin and the attempt to place it within the context of his own time, and I do have some sympathy with that, we can take him at his word. And we can do so because we remain tied to a flawed ideology that ascribes animistic values to buildings which they don't have. They're buildings, they're not sentient beings. Conservation has become a set of interconnecting homilies that have been repeated so many times they've solidified into an acceptable narrative of doctrinal instruction, and the process is played out in a predominantly white, educated middle-class arena. If the industry, and that's what it is, isn't accessible to everybody, then it's neither relevant, groundbreaking, and nothing changes. But hey, let's finish by ditching the science, binning the archaeology, trashing the methodology, and forgetting all about conservation philosophy, and instead ask ourselves a simple question with what I hope is an intuitive answer. Which of these two surfaces is likely to be resilient in a climate change future? Folks, thank you very much for coming along, and do join us at the Lime Finishes group. We're free and inclusive, and I'd be really happy to take your questions.